So we've been looking at the singer and songwriter, right? We've been looking at this industry. It's kind of an interesting industry. And we saw some of the basics of what went on in terms of our band. So we saw that our band would have our personal manager, right, who in essence engages the band in terms of its creative content and basically helps manage a lot of the day-to-day operations in terms of booking sites, hotels, places for concerts, studio time, etc. Right? We also saw that for our bands, for the most part, once they create their demo tape and they send it on, for the most part, you have about 80 to 85% of them fail to recover their costs. So you have a pretty high stiff ratio, right, in terms of, from the studio's standpoint, the record company's standpoint of essentially, you know, how much do we invest in this band, right? Because 4 out of 5 bands that we sign, we're actually going to lose money on. By the time it's all said and done, we're only going to make money from basically 1 of the 5, and the amount of money that we make from that has to be enough to basically cover the cost of what it takes to cover these other bands, right? And so we can have some contracts here that spell out how many albums, how often the albums need to come out, number of albums, how often released, right? And we saw that to a degree, a lot of these are basically an options contract in that the record company doesn't have to necessarily promote the album. So if albums number 1 and 2 are poor sellers, album number 3 is unlikely to sell well as well. And so in essence, by that time, you might be getting to the point where you cut your losses, right? And you release the band from the contract to go to somebody else. So oftentimes what you'll see happen here is you'll see the record studio provide an advance to the band to recover some recording costs. And sometimes to cover anticipated royalties. So in essence, I mean, what you can think of this here, of course, is that if you have 4 different bands, you've got band A, B, C, D, and E. And let's assume we advance each of these people $200,000 for recording costs. And let's assume we also give them some royalties as well. So let's assume we'll give them $100,000 in royalties. Right. You are in essence paying them for royalties that you expect to receive. Right? You're in essence giving them these royalties in advance so they can get the album done and get it out. So what we have here is you can think of this, like we said, you now have for the studio 2, 4, 6, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? $1.5 million that you've paid out. So that in essence, what you see here is you're having a shifting of risk from who to who. Who is risk being shifted from? Mm-hmm. You're shifting risk from the band to the studio, to the record company, right? Because only one of these guys, band E here, is going to make more than $300,000, right? So band A here releases its album. We spent $200,000 recording costs on them, and maybe sales here are, I mean, it could be anything, any number that you want it to be, 50,000, right? And then band B could be 150,000. And band C could be 175,000. And band D could be, it could be anything, I don't know, 30,000. It's a really bad band, all right? And then here, this band right here makes, I don't know, we'll say they make 500,000. It would be ideal, of course, from the studio standpoint to know who's going to make money and who's not going to make money, but that's very, very difficult to determine. Right? It would make things a whole lot simpler. So you have a shifting of risk here from the band to the studios, right? Because the band could go out and borrow $200,000. Go to the recording studio and record. I mean, they could do that. There's nothing that says you can't do that. And then they only have $50,000 in sales. Well, they had $200,000 in recording costs. They're short $150,000 that they're going to have to come up with. That's a lot of burger flipping for the rest of their life to finish paying off that note, right? And for some of these bands, maybe they wouldn't have to flip as many burgers, right? I mean, band C, when they don't make it, they're only $25,000 in the hole. They went out and borrowed $200,000 from First National Bank, and they only made $175,000 on their album. They're still short $200,000. They're still short $25,000, but you know, it's a shifting of risk. So what we see here is that the studio is essentially absorbing a lot of this risk that the band would have to take on their own if the studio wasn't in play. And there's also kind of like this guaranteed minimum. So not only have this shifting of risk, but you also have basically kind of a guaranteed payment. Right, this guaranteed minimum that the band is getting. They know they're getting at least $300,000. They know they're going to make, after the recording studio cost of $200,000, they got $100,000. Right, it's kind of like a guaranteed minimum. If they were to do that on their own, they may not have any guaranteed minimum. Right? In essence, they're shifting the uncertainty of how much they could make, shifting that risk to the studio and saying, okay, we could make a whole lot of money or we could make no money. We want to shift that risk to the studio. We're giving up some of those rights, and in exchange, we're going to get a minimum that's not as much as it could be if we hit it big, but it's more than what we would get if we don't make anything, right? I mean, you're in essence basically shifting, like I said, a lot of the risk. It's kind of like being an entrepreneur, going out and starting your own business. You could make a whole lot of money, or you could make nothing and lose a whole lot of money. Or you can shift that risk and say, I'm just going to go work for some big company. And I get a steady paycheck, right? It's not nearly as much, but you know that you're getting a paycheck every single 2 weeks or every single month or whatever that it is. And you don't have to essentially kind of worry about it. It's that kind of thing. I mean, you're shifting that risk around. So these royalty rates can vary from band to band. Usually between 11 to 13% for new artists. If you're a small independent label, this might be about as 9%. So if you're on a really small label that doesn't have a whole lot of capital, and by capital I mean in the sense of money, not capital the way that economists use it, you can have 14 to 16% for kind of a middle range successful artist. And your superstars can be anywhere between 16 to 20%. All right, so your Michael Jacksons and your, I don't know, Barbra Streisand and your Bieber, Justin Bieber people, whatever, 16 to 20-ish percentage, right? Your middle range artists, 14 to 16, your brand new artists, 11 to 13%, right? These rates also, depending upon the contract, it can vary from studio to studio and band to band, but you might see the royalty rates increasing as album sales increase. Right, that's also possible as well too. So it's not just that you're getting 10% for ever. As the number of albums goes up, your royalty rate can go up as well. So you would think it's fairly simple, right? Oh, okay. If it is, I'm making up a number here, 10%, and if I sell 1 million albums at $10, I myself have $1 million in income, right? Seems simple, but it's not. Because we have the royalty rates as they're outlined in the contract, and then we have what are called the effective royalty rates, which can be changed significantly. So our royalty rate is based upon this album's suggested retail price. But we can reduce this in lots of different ways, right? So for example, we can have packaging charges. So the studio will charge the band for the cost that it takes to produce the packages. Right? So for example, on cassettes, this was 20%. On CDs, it was 25%. So they would charge them a 25% basically cost to package the CD or package the cassette. We can reduce the royalty rate through donated copies. This black's not very good. So the studio can donate copies to radio stations and other things like this. This can be around like a 15% reduction typically. You can boost the wholesale price. But give away more copies, right, to basically alter the royalty rates to have the effective royalty rate reduced. You also have breakage fees. So a breakage fee would say, okay, when these albums were actual albums, LPs, 12-inch things made out of shellac, when you would ship them, some percentage of these guys are going to break. So rather than sitting there counting every single time albums break, they in essence said, we'll just charge some fee, we'll just charge a 10% fee for breakage. Because we assume on average 10% are going to break. Right now 10% didn't break, it was significantly less than that. But it saves the time and cost of having to sit there and keep track of how many of those albums are actually breaking, right? So they would continue to have this breakage fee of 10% way up here when you got to CDs and cassettes. Well, when you ship cassettes and the truck is bouncing along on the roads, how many of these guys are going to break? Or CDs, how many of these guys are going to break? Hardly any, right? CDs are pretty durable, especially if they're in the little case, and they're all tightly wrapped, right? You had the albums in there, they're not as tightly wrapped and the truck is bouncing along and the albums are doing that. You know, some of the albums, the LPs are going to break, but not these guys. So they'd keep this 10% fee for this. They would keep the 10% fee for downloaded copies. How many downloaded copies are going to break? 0, right? You don't have breakage of downloaded copies. So this guy right here, charging this breakage fee for the downloaded copies, that just recently stopped. I mean, they were doing that. It's not like they stopped this 15 years ago. They just stopped it a few years ago, right? Where they would, in essence, charge these breakage fees. And people were just like, this is absolutely ridiculous. You're charging us breakage fees for downloaded copies of the albums. This is stupid. You're clearly ripping us off, all right? So what you would have, by the time it's all said and done, you would have an effective royalty rate here of about 75% of actual shipments. So in essence, what you're saying here is we're going to sell 1 million albums. All right, we're going to ship 1 million albums. The company's going to say, hey, 10% of those are going to break. We're going to charge you another fee for packaging all of those. We're going to charge you some fees for, we're going to change the number of free copies that we give. We're going to charge you for that, basically. I mean, you don't get those for free. And by the time it's all said and done, the band would have sold, say, 1 million copies. They're only collecting royalties on those if they had sold 75% of that, as if they had sold 750,000 albums. Now, what's interesting here is that you know you're going to collect royalties on those 750,000 albums that you've just sold, even though you actually sold 1 million. So you're going to collect royalties from this. But what do you have to pay back first? The recording costs and the advance, right? So in essence, what they say is that, okay, look, you've made, and let's just say it's 10%, because it's a nice round number. You've made 750,000. We've got you selling 1 million albums at $10. You had $10 in sales. Going to give you 10%. That's 1 million here. Now you actually have $750,000 in income. And guess what? You owe us $200,000 for the recording studio back 2 years ago, plus what? Plus interest. We lent you the money at our interest rate that we chose. So we've got our $200,000 in recording costs. Plus interest. Maybe it's $300,000 now, I'm just making up a number. Minus the $100,000 in advance. That's 400. This band here sold 1 million albums at $10 each. They were supposed to have received $1 million worth of income. Now they've actually only received $350,000 worth of income. But let's look at some of these other bands. What happens if we have something completely different? Let's assume that one of these other bands, the royalties on our albums sold is, say, $250,000. So here's one of our other bands, $250,000 worth of royalties. Hey, we got a $200,000 recording cost from 2 years ago. You guys were in studio the same time band E was. So we're also going to charge you interest. We gave you a $100,000 advance. $250,000 minus $400,000. Negative $150,000 that you owe us. So here's album 1. We're at negative $250 on this guy. When we go to album 2, let's assume album 2 makes money. Same thing in recording costs. We'll just assume $200,000 in recording costs. Same thing in an advance. Let's assume it's $100,000. Only this time that album does well. That album does, let's say it's $500,000 in royalties. So here's album 2. So we got $500,000 in royalties minus 200, or what do we say, $300,000 in recording costs by the time it's all said and done. Minus our $100,000 in advance. That leaves us with $100,000 in album 2. But what's the problem? They're still in the hole from album 1. So what the studio does is they say, thank you very much for the $100,000 excess on album 2. We're going to take that $100,000 excess. We're going to apply it over here to album 1, which has negative $250,000, which of course by now, thanks to interest, is now up to negative $275,000 plus your $100,000. Congratulations, you're now only $175,000 in the hole on album number 1. And album number 2 is now zeroed out. And now we'll come up here to album number 3. And album number 3 can do very well too. Maybe it does $600,000 in royalties. Let's assume $300,000 in recording costs as well. Another $100,000 advance because, you know, the artist has to eat while he's cranking out the albums. 300. Now we have 200,000. So here, album 3, we're up 200 on this guy. But guess what? Hey, you still owe us $175,000 from album 1 6 years ago, which, by the way, thanks to interest, is now negative $225,000. We're going to take your $200,000, we're going to apply it to this guy. And now you're only $25,000 in the hole. So an enduring feature of this, like we said, is this option structure, right? If I'm the studio, this looks pretty good to me. Album 1 and album 2 made money. Let's go for album number 4. What happens though if you're in the situation where album number 2 wasn't up 100,000, it was down 100,000? 250, 275 minus 100,000, you wouldn't be up, you'd be down 375, right? And then if you did that with album number 2, or album number 3 here, let's assume album number 3 wasn't up 200, it was down 200. So this 375 becomes, say, 4 with interest. Have our negative 200 here. This guy becomes negative 200. Now we're at negative 600. If I'm the studio, what am I thinking here with this band? Cut them. They're no good. Every time that we release an album, they're not making any, they're not even covering the cost of these additional albums. They're never going to make it. All right? We're done with you. 3 albums, you've had your shot. Go do something else, whatever that something else is. We're going to release you from the contract. All right? It looks somewhat unfair to the musician, but it has some logic to it, right? I mean, like we said, in essence, what you're doing is you're shifting risk from the band to the studio. Because 4 out of 5 bands aren't going to make it anyway, right? You're shifting risk from me personally going out and borrowing $200,000 to record, plus I need food to eat, $100,000. Me personally going out and borrowing $300,000. And assuming all of that risk myself and being able to shift that risk to the studio. And of course, I get some kind of guaranteed minimum payment. Hey, at least I made $100,000 during all of these years. Album 1, 2, 3, over a 6-year time period, I made $50,000 a year, right, on average. Got $100,000 all at one time, and I had to make it go out over 2 years. But hey, over these 6 years, I had $50,000 worth of income for recording music. I had my shot, blah, I'm done, right? You have a question?
Yeah, do like the bands own their merchandise and stuff, or is that like a royalty too?
It depends on the contract. Typically, you've got some splitting between the band and the studio. Where studios used to make money was album sales, right? And concerts would promote album sales. Now it's the other way around. Album sales promote concerts. And typically what you'll have with the concerts is bands have some guaranteed minimum. We'll guarantee you at least $10,000 for playing JQH Arena, whatever the number is. It's going to be any number that you want it to be. And once we've covered the cost of what it takes to rent the studio or to rent the JQH, plus all this other stuff, then you'll get some split, 60-40, 60% artist, 40% promoter, or maybe up to 90-10, 90% artist, 10% promoter, right? So like the Eagles, when the Eagles came and played here several years ago, I mean, I guarantee they had a pretty high minimum, and they were getting a large percentage. Their guaranteed was probably, 90-10, right? I mean, the whole JQH Arena sold out within like 10 minutes. I mean, it was completely done, right? And then some other band might not be nearly as much. Maybe it's a 60-40 split with the guaranteed minimum after costs are incurred. So these royalty streams can have some competing incentives too, right? Because, I mean, let's think about this in terms of recording costs. Let's assume that the label has said, we're just going to basically let you have, not free reign, but, you do what you need to do to record the album. In the band's mind, the longer they're in studio, the greater the chance the album has to be successful, right? Which is true. However, in the studio's mind, the longer the band is in studio, the higher the cost, right? And there's only a 20% chance that they're going to make it anyway. So the band has this incentive to be in studio as long as possible because that increases the chances of them going from band A basically to band E, right? But the studio says, hey, you know, the longer you're in studio, the longer you're recording, all that you're really doing, I mean, you have the same probability of being successful. Basically, it's not going to change that much. We're still out maybe not $200,000. Now we're out maybe $300,000-$400,000 in recording cost. You're actually making it harder and harder and harder for us to basically recoup our money. So you have this constant conflict between bands and the studio, right? The studio wants, or the recording company wants people in studio as little as possible, get the thing done and get out. The band has this incentive to be in studio as long as possible, kind of helps increase their chances of doing well, right? Because if they're a blockbuster, if it does well, then they can make money. If it does poorly, they're not out money. See what I'm saying? Their cost, whether it loses big or loses a little, is the same. But if it wins big, they win big, right? So you have a lot of incentive here for the band to basically kind of go big or go home. And of course, the studio wants to manage some of that risk and say, hey, we want to decrease the probability that you're going to be costing us money. We want you to have as little time in studio as possible. So this kind of effective royalty rate is kind of really interesting, I think. And it's been used with lots of different bands, right? I mean, so for example, you would think the Beatles, I mean, you expect this to happen to Joe Blow's band and the so-and-so that nobody's ever heard of out of Springfield, Missouri, right? But this was also used in other big bands. Like, so for example, the Beatles are suing one of their studios, and they said they were cheated out of $50 million in royalties, all right? That the studio did with basically kind of the same thing what you saw with movies, with movie accounting, with studio accounting, saying we're going to charge you these different types of breakage fees, we're going to charge you these types of fees for this, we're going to charge you for studio time, and we're going to charge you this type of interest rate, right, which is completely unreasonable interest rate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So I find it interesting that in today's world where the studios are really, really interested in making sure that the artists get their royalties, we've got to make sure the artists get their royalties. You can't steal music. You got to buy it from these different sites, iTunes or Amazon or whatever. We don't want you stealing music, right? You're cheating artists out of their money. That's what they tell you again and again and again and again and again. That in essence, to a degree, they're doing the exact same thing, right? It doesn't cost 25%. It doesn't cost $2.50 to package a CD. I guarantee you that. It costs nowhere near 25%. It doesn't make any sense to charge a 10% breakage fee for an MP3. That's just, you're just stealing money, basically. That's all that you're really doing. Just call it what it is, right? Charging interest rates over here that are basically unreasonable so that you can get an extra $50 million out of the Beatles, right? Not that they don't already have enough money, they do, but hey, they're the ones that earned it. So let's look at these different royalty streams that we have. Because we can collect royalties in several different ways. We have performance. We have mechanical. We have synchronization. And we have printed music. So with our printed music here, our artists typically get about 20% of the retail price. So if you're in a band and you buy the sheet music for some artists, and that sheet music is some number, whatever that number is, $12 a sheet to get the sheet music for Justin Bieber's song. He's getting basically about 20% of that. Okay. And these artists are going to maintain their copyrights for life, plus 50 years. Okay. After this, these songs revert to the public domain. So as long as you're alive, you're going to collect royalties on your songs. When you're dead, your estate gets the royalties from those songs for the next 50 years. After 50 years after you're dead, then those songs go into the public domain and royalty payments don't have to be made. So for example, you've got Jim Morrison and the Doors. He dies at the age 27, right? His family sues, his mom and dad sue and say, hey, we want the royalties. His common law wife sues and says, no, I'm the common law wife. I want the royalties. It goes to court. Judge says, yeah, she's the common law wife. She's the owner of the estate. So she gets all the royalties. 3 years later, she dies. Her parents get the royalties. So all of the music that Jim Morrison and the Doors, that all of the money that when you buy a song of the Doors or you buy an album of the Doors or they play that song in a whatever, I mean, any time you hear the song, there's a royalty payment made. Some of that royalty payment goes to Jim Morrison. It would have gone to his estate, his parents, because he didn't have, his siblings didn't get it. It went to his common law wife. But she's not alive anymore, so it goes to her estate, and her estate is her parents, right? So all of the money that you make doesn't go to Jim Morrison's kids. He didn't have kids. It doesn't go to his siblings. It goes to his girlfriend's parents, right? I mean, that's where the money goes. So, and for 50 years, I mean, I can't remember when he died. It's getting probably close to 50, but I think they're still making money from it, right? So, this performance here, right? Any public performance of music. You're going to pay royalties on, right? So this is live entertainment, jukeboxes, background music, music you listen to while you're on hold on the phone, right? When you call up Equifax and you say, look, you guys made it so me and 142,999,999 fellow Americans got all of our information stolen. And we're on the phone for 30 minutes with them and you're hearing music. That's performance. There's a royalty payment being made for that. Mechanical, these are the royalties paid for each copy of the song recorded. So when these were initially done, they were 2 cents per song. That was in 1909, which is when that was set. That rate persisted until 1976, where they said, look, 2 cents isn't very much. You got to increase this royalty rate, right? So now this royalty rate is 9.1 cents per song, or 1.75 cents per minute, whichever's greater, right? So for example, Pink Floyd has some songs that are 30 minutes long. They're not getting 9.1 cents for that song. They're getting 1.75 cents times each minute for that song, right? So when you go to iTunes and you download a song from some artist, whoever it is, Madonna, whoever it can be, any person that you want it to be, and you're paying $1.29, 9.1 cents of that goes to Madonna, right? And if the song is larger, if it's a 10-minute song, 17.5 cents of that goes to Madonna. Synchronization royalties. This is when a song is played on TV or in a movie, something like that. These are purely negotiable and are not basically set by statute. So these can be, it kind of depends, right? Some of these fees can be, for TV, can be $3,000 to say $8,000. Others could be, say, $35,000 for a movie. Kind of varies. And it also varies based upon how the song is being used and what it's being used for. So if you've got a song, and I'm just making up a stupid example. If you've got a song that's being used to sell tampons, that song is going to be associated with tampons, right? If that commercial's successful enough and people get really into that commercial, that can diminish the value of that song in other formats. And so it's possible, depending upon what it's being used for, you might not want $35,000, you might want, say, $50,000. Right? Because once it's associated with that product, its value in terms of other products and in terms in other uses and other movies and stuff is diminished. And you don't want to give that up. Okay, we're done with Unit 1 stuff. We'll discuss when we'll have our test on Friday. Okay?